Hello, welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. In this episode, we continue the story of Myra and the online school for adventuring. Myra and her friends depart on their great quest into the woods. As you might imagine, the next part of this story is going to be a little more tense and exciting, and might be too much for the very youngest listeners. Anyone comfortable with the Percy Jackson or Harry Potter books should feel right at home in this part of the story. I hope you're enjoying it. As Myra and her friends followed Doa and Veer into the forest, Myra noticed Doa stop for a moment and step off the path and confer with two large bucks. One of them had a broken antler, and the other had the largest, fluffiest tail she had ever seen on a deer. When Doa rejoined them a moment later, Myra asked Doa, "Who were they?" "Well," said Doa, "those were our scouts." "What are they scouting?" asked Myra. "Well, the one with the broken antler is going to go keep an eye on the string demon," said Doa. "That sounds dangerous," said Myra.
Why do you think
Doa nodded. "Yes," she said. "He is very brave to volunteer for this duty." "But why?" said Myra. "Because," said Doa, as they walked along, "the only thing more dangerous than scouting to know where the string demon is not scouting to know where the string demon is." "That is a good point," said Myra. "What about the other one with the tail?" "Yeah," said Doa, "that's quite a tail, isn't it?" Myra felt like Doa was appreciating on a different level than she was.
I didn't need that comment. Stop sexualizing the deer.
I wasn't doing it. It was my character. It's very in character. Anyway, Myra said, "What? So where's he going?" "He's going," said Doa, "to scout out ahead of us." "But why?" said Myra. "I mean, if Broken Horn's keeping an eye on the string demon..." Doa sort of smiled gently. She said, "Myra, it's a big forest. There are a lot of other dangers besides the string demon." "Oh," said Myra. Chelsea had dropped back to walk beside them. "Like what?" she asked. Doa shrugged. "Lots of things," she said. There are ordinary things like packs of wolves and wild boars, and then there are forest fairies who are, unhappy about humans wandering around in their forest. There are giant spiders, of course. "Yes," said Myra, "I'm familiar with those." "Well, those aren't the only thing that come in giant sizes. There are giant centipedes." "No," said Myra, "we're done having this conversation. I tell you what, if something starts approaching us that we need to know about, you just let me know." They started walking along, and Hetty and Willow got into sort of a theological discussion as they walked along about whether the great tree at the center of the forest was some kind of like forest god or like a forest spirit or just like a really big tree that had animated. And Veer explained to them what the deer believed about it, that it was like the living avatar of God's will to create this forest and to protect it and guide it. And so it was a conversation that the three of them found fascinating and everybody else not so much. So Myra kind of wandered ahead with Corin, sort of scouting ahead a bit. And because they were scouting ahead, they were the first ones to spot the deer with the big fluffy tail coming running back towards them fairly quickly. Myra started to walk towards him and then realized, hey, she didn't speak deer. And so instead, she ran back along with him until they ran into Doa. Doa conferred with the deer for a moment. She said, "All right, everyone, there's a pack of wargs coming this direction. They haven't caught our scent, but it would be best if they didn't know we were here." So she looked around briefly. "Up a tree. And so they all looked around and each found a good tree or two, and they all climbed. Myra found it was surprisingly easy to climb a tree when you were suddenly worried about wargs. And so they were securely up the tree with the fluff-tailed deer off in the forest when they could hear the sounds of the pack approaching. The pack was not quiet. Clearly they were not on the hunt. They were sort of making yipping noises and little hoo noises and an occasional grrr to each other as they went along. Myra suddenly realized that being up a tree was not going to do them much good if the wargs could smell them. She looked around for Willow and saw that Willow was up a different tree. So she sort of waved frantically to her, but Willow did not notice. Fortunately, Chelsea, who was sitting next to her, did, and she finger signed in the sneaker speech to Myra to ask what, and Myra finger signed back, "Tell Willow to hide our scents." And she saw Chelsea lean over to Willow, and Willow closed her eyes for a minute and started to wave her hands and almost fell off the branch she was sitting on. And fortunately, Chelsea sort of grabbed her and held her in place, and Willow finished whatever she was doing just as the warg stepped into the clearing below them. Myra had seen wolves before. She had even seen very large wolves before. Wargs were a different thing entirely. They were roughly the size of ponies, and they clearly were not just ordinary animals. There was the light of intelligence in their eyes, and the sounds that they made to each other, Myra felt like sounded like a language, just one that she didn't speak. Their whole group stayed quiet as the wargs walked by underneath them. And then, once they were gone, she saw Veer and Doa both hold up hands and hold fingers to their lips, and so they stayed quiet, and they saw the largest of the wargs they had seen lope by below them. It paused momentarily and sniffed the ground, and then looked around, but then continued on its way. After a few minutes, the deer with the fluffy tail came back into the clearing, and they all climbed down the trees. "What was that last one?" Myra asked Doa as they reached the ground. "That was the matriarch of the pack," said Doa. "She brings up the rear, makes sure no one is sneaking up on the pack, and generally watches out for them." "Do you think they know we were here?" "Well," said Doa, "it's always hard to know with wargs. They're definitely smart enough to notice us and pretend that they didn't, but we'll know soon enough." "That's not the comforting thing I was hoping you were going to say," said Myra. Doa shrugged and headed off into the forest. After walking for several hours, Myra began to distinctly feel that they were not in the part of the forest near the school anymore. It had just a older feel to it. The trees seemed larger, and there were different shapes to the leaves that she had never seen in the trees around the school. Also, for part of the time around the school, they had been keeping an eye out for giant spiders with webs stringing from one tree to the next, and those had gradually tapered off as they had walked. They stopped for lunch at midday, and she had asked Veer about it. He had shrugged. He said, "The giant spiders don't really come to this part of the forest." "Why?" asked Antoine. "Nothing for them to eat here?" Said Veer. More like there are things that eat them here." "Oh," said Antoine. They spent the afternoon walking a little more quietly and a little more carefully, but the scouting deer did not return, and the afternoon was uneventful. Just as the sun was setting, they climbed up sort of a low hill, and there was a rocky outcropping on top. "All right," said Doa, "this is where we'll make camp for the night. It has good visibility in all directions, and we can see anything coming. We'll have a watch 2 at a time. What are we watching for? Asked Corin. Anything, said Doa. Okay, said Corin. What do we do if we see something? Wake everyone up, said Vera. Is this the first time you all have ever had a watch? No, said Corin, but I've never really spent the night in a forest before. Well, said Doa, you're probably in for a treat. It's beautiful at night in the forest. It can be dangerous too, but it can be beautiful. And so they made camp, and Myra and Corin volunteered to take second watch. So Myra rolled herself up in her sleeping roll and, exhausted from the walk of the day, fell asleep almost instantly. That is the end for tonight. Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. I created today's show, but questions and running commentary were supplied by my children. The theme music was created by Brandon Thompson, and our wonderful logo was designed by Silas Swindelin. If you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. Do you want more stories? You can now subscribe to the show and help pick a new story for me to tell every month. The show's website is storiesforwonderfulchildren.com. Until next time, I'm Dan Wendelin, reminding you to tell someone you love a story.